Hello and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the Office of Sustainability. The Office of Sustainability provides the university as a model of best practices and a leader within interdisciplinary research to help individuals and communities understand the interconnection between humans and the environment and to address the urgent sustainability challenges of our time. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is Earth Week, the role of arts in climate change and communication. Liz Ivkovich, Director of Development for Utah Presents, will moderate today's discussion. She is joined by panelist Hassa Borup, Professor of Violin and Head of String and Chamber Music Studies, Catherine Coles, Distinguished Professor of English, John C. Lin, Professor of Atmospheric Studies, Wendy Wisher, Associate Professor of Art and Art History. If you have any questions, please enter them in the YouTube chat. And with that, I will turn the time over to Liz.
Thank you, Anne. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I want to say a huge thank you to Anne and to Molly Wheeler and Ariel Clark-Prophet for putting together this panel. As Anne mentioned, I'm Liz Ivkovich. I'm the Development Director at Utah Presents. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that we are standing on Native land right now. I want to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. I'm delighted to be here with members of the Artism for Earth project. And I'd like to introduce that project in their own words with a little trailer that they've put together. So I'm going to go ahead and share that right now. Clicking my share button.
I am delighted to welcome you to Artism for Earth. I am so proud of the progress we have made at the University of Utah over the past decade in becoming more aware of our environmental impact.
The Earth's climate is changing, and the impacts are all around us.
Can we slow the effects of climate change? Can we adapt to create a more resilient planet for humans and nature? Can we protect communities that are disadvantaged and most at risk? What kind of future do we want to leave for the next generation? These questions stir powerful emotions. How can we emotionally process the scale of the changes that affect us all?
As we collectively confront climate change, the arts and humanities can shine new light on this critical conversation by presenting the issues from unique and novel perspectives.
We invite you to join us on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2021, when the project will premiere with online events, primarily set right here at the Natural History Museum of Utah.
Through this project, we hope to enhance understanding, inspire caring, and catalyze action.
That's wonderful, wonderful preview of what all the different elements of the project are. And I'd love to now turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and share a little bit more about Artism for Earth. Hassa, would you take it away?
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting us and taking interest in this project. I'll just briefly, you saw a lot of what we're trying to do in this this trailer, which just came off the press last night. So everything is happening very quickly now to get ready for next Thursday, Earth Day. But I think it gives a good view of what we're trying to accomplish. And maybe I could just, before we go into some details about some of the sub-projects that we have fostered in this collaboration, as one of the people that took the initiative to pursue this idea, my motivation as a performer who has performed many places around the world and traveled a lot and done sort of what a performer does, which is to be out and about, was a growing sense of, as we see challenges in society as a whole, what is my role as a communicator in this, and what is it that I can do to use my talents to help in bigger issues rather than just the next concert or the next travel, the next tour, etc. So for me, it's a desire that has built up over a number of years, and finally, last year or 2019, I was participating at a festival in New York where Judy Lockhead, that some of you may know, a distinguished professor at SUNY Stony Brook, had a forum of how does art influence society and societal change. And that was sort of a little bit of a wake-up call for me, where we went through a lot of sort of historical cycles of human civilization and the role that the arts played in that, and how I felt of what one of the discussion points that we had at that forum was, why is it that an issue like climate change seems so separated from our daily expressive lives? Why is it that it is something that seems in some ways separated from other major issues that we are confronting? So I think my desire to be involved in this and try to start this up was to find a way, especially emotionally, to connect with some of these things, some of these really difficult emotions, and foster change that way. So it's not just, again, another study that shows that the sea level is rising, not another study that shows all this devastation, but a way for us to process it and understand it. And that's sort of the beginning point of this project.
Thank you. John?
Let me try to share some slides. And here. This coming up?
Yep.
Okay. Well, I just want to start by thanking Hassa, who first contacted me a few years ago at the start of this project. And I'm a professor in atmospheric sciences, so this is definitely something new for me. But I think it's a really important aspect of my work in terms of outreach. And I think Hassa sort of nailed it on the head when he talked about emotions, because often the thought about scientists is they're kind of objective and not as much emotional. But I think there's ways that I think science and scientific data can tap into human emotions and engaging different senses. So what we've done, my group has mainly so far been making the invisible pollution visible. And let me explain what that means. So probably those of us in the Salt Lake Valley are probably too familiar with our wintertime pollution problem. So this is a picture of our valley during the infamous inversion events. And it's so striking for us because we're used to these majestic views of our beautiful mountains. But during those wintertime events, there's a very strong visual cue in which we stop seeing these mountains. So that immediately taps into our emotions. And more I've realized in the time I'm here, the past 10 years or so, when people are becoming more and more aware of our air quality problem. However, there are many other pollutants that are not visual. They're invisible. And key among them is carbon dioxide, or CO2, which is the main gas behind climate change. Okay, so one key aspect of our work is to make that pollution visible. So here's my wonderful group. The fellow in the back, the really tall one, is not part of our group, former NBA player, Bill Walton. So he's not part of our group, but everyone else is. And what we do in our group is to use research grade instruments to measure pollution. And this is a lab on top of the William Browning building on campus, where the atmospheric sciences department is. And you can peek in. I invite you in the post-pandemic era to come up to this building and just peek in to see our instruments and sometimes us in there at work. This is the Utah Trace Gas and Air Quality Lab, or UATAC lab, and we attack pollution, so to speak, by observing and understanding it. We also display the data in real time at air.utah.edu. So just feel free to browse that website and look at our data. Now, I want to come back to the theme of today's project, in which we engage different senses. But I want to contrast that by what we've been doing mainly in the scientific field, which is generating plots like this. Okay, so this is a graph of carbon dioxide. And this is the carbon dioxide we measure in Salt Lake City. And we've been measuring it for the past 20 years or so. And I'll just show you briefly this map of our network of carbon dioxide measurements, CO2. And this was started by my colleagues in biology, Diane Pataki, Dave Bowling, and Jim Elleringer, who started it around the Winter Olympics, so 2001. So this is a 20-year record now, and it's a really fantastic record of carbon dioxide, this invisible gas that causes climate change. And it's the longest running urban CO2 network in the entire world, right here in Salt Lake, managed by the University of Utah. Okay, and it's showing these patterns, and that is what I'm showing right here. And these are some of the more typical kind of graphs that we draw as scientists. But this already tells a story. Here's Salt Lake City here. You can see the spikes. Those are the inversion events. And it's also higher compared to some sort of a global mean, which is in red. That's measured on top of a volcano in Hawaii, Mauna Loa. So you can see a lot of patterns, the inversion events showing the spikes, the more elevated values, which is a combination of human emissions and weather. But what's also powerful, we superimpose this on this amazing record, 800,000 year record of CO2 derived from ice core measurements and temperature. Okay, and you can see this really striking correlation between CO2 and temperature. And the past few hundred years jump out really clearly as something that is quite extraordinary in terms of how high carbon dioxide is. These days, global average is above 400 parts per million. So the natural question is, what would temperatures be and what climate will be like in the next few decades? Okay, so that is something scientists like me have done for a long time, these kind of graphs. But what I'm excited about through this collaboration is to go beyond the visual. I talked about making things visible, but you can engage a lot of other senses and tap into deep human emotions through sound, through poetry, through other kinds of media. So that's where I'll just show you a teaser from our collaboration. This is between myself, my colleague Tim Garrett, who is a whiz in many ways. he took our CO2 observations and turned it into sound by doing something called a Fourier transform. And then Elizabeth Corbello, professor of music, turned into music. So you went from scientific data to music. On top of that, Julia Corbett in communication environmental humanities added text to it. So this is a sort of 40-second sort of a preview of this wonderful collaboration that I want to show.
Take a deep, full breath. The air that just entered your lungs and bloodstream, the air that keeps you alive, is the same air that's in constant circulation around the earth.
So that's a sneak preview. Hopefully you can listen to the whole piece and many other wonderful pieces on Earth Day. So thank you.
Thank you, John. And it was lovely to have a moment to just breathe with that work as well. Catherine. Oh, you're muted. Let me see if I can unmute you.
That was my fault. Sorry about that. John, thank you. That was a really great transition to what I'm going to talk about. First, I want to thank Hassa, especially and Ariel, for setting this up. And then I want to talk just briefly about poetry, because why wouldn't we want to talk about poetry? Then I'm going to read one of the two poems that was set for this project. And we're going to finish with Hassa playing a little bit of a clip of the setting of that poem. So I really appreciate the emphasis that Hassa and John have given us on process and processing, and then especially on emotion. Our group's first meeting began with a discussion about how we might address the dearth of information about climate change. And I sat there as a poet thinking, if this is our job, a bunch of artists are not the right people to do it. As William Carlos Williams said, you can't get the news from poetry. Besides that, I don't know about any of you, but I'm actually pretty much up to here in information. We can be glutted in it simply by turning a knob. So the question I hope we'll spend a little more time on today becomes, what does art do that knob turning can't? I really like John's idea about art making things visible. So the question I want to address now is, how does poetry in particular work to do that? And how in a project like this, can two or more art forms operate together to expand and elaborate on our human experience? Poetry, as I try to practice it, lives in uncertainty and contradiction. It leverages language and the perceptual system to create a complex space in which a reader or listener can have an experience engaging the intellect, all the senses, and the emotions together. Poetry seeks to generate an apprehension of a newly discovered reality, call it beauty, that emerges in the poem through what I call passionate thinking. As Auden famously lamented, poetry makes nothing happen. But as C.D. Wright said, it is a function of poetry to locate those zones inside us that would be free and declare them so. The poem I'm going to read and that Javier Beteta set to music centers on the fact that the way in which humans usually see whales die is hardly ever how they actually die, which is mostly out of our view. What transpires from that kind of death is called a whale fall. I'm going to read the poem of that title without further comment, then Hassa will play the short clip of Javier's setting. Whale fall. Because they live in the dark, mostly they live in their ears, listening, singing back. We drop microphones and eavesdrop below the surface, letting them make us fishers of sound. They surface when they want and bob, pointing their eyes at us in our strange vessels and bright flotation vests. Why don't we come on in? They flip and dive and return, great temptresses and wink. And finally, when they've exhausted our capacity to amuse them, roll their vastness into greater vastness. Because they sometimes throw themselves onto our shores, enormous, evacuated, where they never meant to be, and like any body, stink. We think we know their fates. But when they come to their ends in deep waters, like us alone, they sink back to where they came from, out of sight and deep, where we all came from, whether or not we end there. Now, quickly to introduce the clip, our other collaborators include the performers Ronak Tadarethi from the Magdalene Choir School under the direction of Melanie Malinka, Kasia Sokol-Borup, Victor Uzer, and Jason Hardink. And what I'd like to ask you to think about, and maybe we can chat about it a little bit later in the discussion, is first your experience of the poem by itself, and second, how the poem changes for you, even within the few seconds of the clip Hassa has prepared. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. And now I'd like to turn it over to Wendy to introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. And I certainly also want to thank Hassa for inviting me to be part of this collaboration. And also to thank Ariel for inviting me to participate in this panel. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how art can influence just our ideas about climate change. And one of the things that I think art can do that makes it unique is art can really provoke. It can question without providing an answer. It can tug on the heartstrings. Usually when we are moved to take action or to make a change, it is because we have felt something, whether that's concern or fear or loss or love. And so I think art has a way of being able to look at some of this data and translate it into a meaningful experience for individuals at the individual level. And I think that's going to be one of our best hopes of being able to find solutions or find resilience, is to be able to care about not only our surroundings, but also each other. And so I'd like to share with you just a couple of projects that I have worked on as kind of an example for this. And I'm going to share my screen here. This is a project that I did in 2019 with Jeffrey Moore, who's a geophysicist at the University of Utah. And he really takes this kind of recording vibrational activity through seismic recorders of red rock arches, and specifically red rock arches that exist in what used to be protected Grand Case Escalante and Bears Ears. As you can see here, these are boundaries he created. On the left is what Escalante, the original boundary, created over 20 years ago, and what it was reduced to in 2017. And then Bears Ears and what it was reduced to. And what I did was create these boundaries out of mirror. And so the viewers saw themselves or not saw themselves in the tiny fragments of the reduced boundaries within the piece, a reference to them being stakeholders, a reference to them having impact. Across from these was a large chalk drawing on the wall of an arch, and it was accompanied by erasers. You could erase it, but you couldn't add to it. These rock arches were created over millennia, and when they're gone, they aren't going to return anytime soon. And it was kind of this idea of having that visible. Once it's gone, all we have left is a photograph. There was also a multimedia sound project where you could not only hear the sound of the vibrations, which normally come in at about 4 hertz, well below what the human hears at about 20 hertz. We had amplified them, sped them up so that they were audible, but left some really low. And so the viewers were able to not only hear the sound piece, but also feel it and kind of get into it. Our goal was really to show how rock isn't static. It is dynamic and it responds to its environment and all the things that we as humans do within the environment. Another piece was at the Natural History Museum recently, where I created a spiral room that allowed you to see 360 degrees of video. And this piece I really thought of as kind of a love letter to nature. It spans 24 minutes, kind of imitating 24 hours from sunrise to sunset. I had also collaborated with musicians Michael Wall and Austin Booth from the University of Utah to create this piece that really was intended to be meditative and allow people to be reminded of what nature brings to us, of the peace and the emotions that it can instill through its beauty. For this particular collaboration with Artism for Earth, I created a video that is really looking at dark clouds, this idea of loss, the idea of the looming kind of fear that we have when we think about what we face. And it was projected on performer Hasaburo. It included, well, he played John Luther Adams' Three High Places. And so normally a spotlight illuminates the performer. And in this case, he was illuminated and obscured by the clouds that were passing overhead. As the performance went on, the clouds separated and he became in light. And so really thinking of kind of moving from loss to hope. And the other collaboration I did was with Catherine Coles. We did a series of it was a poem with a video that exists in 9 parts in between the different performances. Started out in black and white in segments and ended up here in the full image. Really thinking about wind. It's called Only the Wind. Wind circulates the whole planet, that we are all affected by the same winds, and it's visible within the trees. And so we kind of created that as a linking thread throughout all of the pieces.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, all of you, for your introductions. And I'm even more honored to be here with you and have an opportunity to take a deeper dive into some of your work on this project. One of the goals of the project is to inspire dialogue. And I like, Wendy, how you said that art can provoke a question without providing an answer. And I'm thinking to Catherine, from one of the lines from your poem said, we think we know their fate. So to me, there's something, a theme through all of this about unknowing and uncertainty. And I wonder, what kinds of things are you hoping that audience members will grapple with as they watch or view or interact with your work in some way? What kind of dialogue are you hoping to inspire? Yeah. I see a few folks unmuted, so go ahead and jump in.
If I can jump in for a second, I think to me, it's really the idea that, to go back to what I said in the beginning, it seems like the idea of climate change has become so polarizing, at least in this country, that we need a different dimension to connect on this. We need somebody to be allowed to see, hopefully, one of the things that we are producing for this project, and who would maybe be inspired to look more into what it is you can do as an individual to help or to change the world. I think it very much happens on the individual level, the individual emotional level. Because as Kate was saying, we have enough information. We have the information we need. So it seems to me that if we can't, the idea of coming together is so important. And I feel, and this is something that I've talked a lot with my co-director, Elizabeth Corbello, about as we've been putting this together, if we as a large group of faculty and collaborators, not just here at the University of Utah, but our external collaborating teams at Harvard, UVA, Stanford, if we can show that we can come together under a pandemic even, and we can actually bring this project together and show how you collaborate, that in itself should serve as an inspiration for what we need to do. So the artworks is one thing, but the concept of the whole project is another. So that would just be my sort of, a big picture view on that.
So I would add to that. I'm completely on board with that, but I would add and maybe elaborate on that by saying that for me as an artist, the goal I always have is simply to move somebody. And I think that the idea of motion is something that we shouldn't just acknowledge as something that happens internally. Relating to what Wendy said before, it seems to me that movement begins with being moved internally and then can be maybe translated into some sort of external activity or motion. That's not the goal I have when I write upon. The goal that I have is actually that internal movement that is maybe the catalyst for something else. And what that something else is, I can't predict. But I can imagine, as I have seen the images and the projects coming together, people actually coming away from the event on the 22nd haunted by what they're seeing, haunted in the fact that they're occupied by it, that they carry it inside themselves. And if they are moved in that way, there's always just the opening or the possibility that some action externally might emerge out of that.
I agree. I often think that if we care about something, we tend to tread a little lighter. And so for me, I'm really interested in kind of helping people reconnect in our digital technological world, which is amazing in so many ways, sometimes provides a path of disconnection from our natural environment. And so the connection we feel is not necessarily watching something on a screen, but it's by experiencing it or by realizing how it can affect us personally, rather than just in another state, in another country, on the other side of the globe. And that these, just like the wind, it comes around full circle and can affect us. And so I'm really interested in those connections that people have. I also think that art in general, goes beyond the five senses, because we have, our five senses of how we know the world, but we also have our imagination and our intuition and our belief system and our dreams. And art can kind of take those intangible things and bring them back into the five senses where we're able to communicate with each other. And I think at its core, art can communicate and expand communication in different ways. And interdisciplinary approaches are going to be the only way that we come out of this with a sense of resilience, with a sense of tenacity and a caring. And that's all the different disciplines. So what I love about this project and others that I've been involved in is really using the sciences along with art. They aren't that separate. The goals are often the same. They just have different means of communicating those goals.
John, I'd love to hear from you on that point. The arts and sciences aren't separate.
Yeah, well, I think as we talk over Zoom, I think we heard earlier about the pandemic. I just can't stop thinking about the pandemic, but that's such a powerful example of what science and art and human emotions and imaginations, bringing all of that can do. And I think these days we're seeing, in some ways, the miracles of modern science at play. I'll be getting my second vaccine soon, but it's clear that that's not enough, right? To beat this pandemic, we need so much more. We need people to care about each other and take care of each other in various ways we've been hearing about, and I won't repeat them here, but in some ways that is true for climate change as well. And in some ways the climate change challenge is even bigger. But I think about when I teach my atmospheric science class, air pollution class, there are many examples that give me hope. And I'll just bring up one, which is the ozone hole, which the science was there to identify the problem. There was policy devised to deal with it, and people cared. And in some ways, there are indications the ozone hole is recovering. So there are good examples. And I think, I do think the pandemic in a year from now would be that as well.
I love that segue into my next question, which is, I appreciate, Catherine, you talking about this, that there is so much news, we're getting so much information about this challenging moment we're in of global climate change. What gives you all hope? How do you find hope? How do you bring that into your work?
I think that's a really good question. Some days I have more hope than others. Some days I don't have any, which is something we discussed as a group a lot, this idea of loss. And I think that's part of the emotions that naturally come, a sense of being overwhelmed with so much information, so much devastation. I've been watching a lot of David Attenborough, and my heart just drops. Like, I feel a physical pain and sense of loss. And I think art is going to be the way to also help us grieve and help us go through those emotions, because they're there. And to deny that they're there, I think, is what allows people to turn that knob off and to not see it. And so I think, as much as it is to embrace the information and learn the information, internalize it, we also are going to have to internalize and deal with our grief and deal with, we will lose things. There are some things that, will disappear. And so that's a really important part. And I think, one of the things that gives me hope is working with other people who have the same goals and who also want to try and work through their own grief to find that measure of hope and to, continue to pursue that. We've been a tenacious species from the beginning, and to kind of hang on to that is something that I try and do. But like I say, some days there's more of it than others.
Well, and I would tag on to that and say that what gives me hope is, the fact that we are seeing change. I mean, we are seeing things that do change to the better, and it has to be built a little bit at a time. I think, a project like this is even more important because there's so many other things in society that are challenging, from racial tensions to inequities in society in general. And I think somehow they're easier for us to sort of deal with because they're interhuman in some ways. They're all connected. Climate change is extremely connected to all these social justice issues. But for some reason, it's easier for us to connect with the human level. And the challenge is that, we have, over the millennia, over the centuries, we have separated, as at least the Western civilization has separated from the integration of nature. We have allowed ourselves to be us and nature. We are not in nature. We are not with nature. And it gives us this perpetual, for those of us who care about it, it gives you this perpetual sort of feeling of guilt. And it's this guilt that we internalized because we can't express it well enough, at least. And for me, at least, having a hope of expressing that and communicating that would hopefully spur even more change. And in the bigger scheme of things, we are reaching a lot of people with this project, but it's still, on a global level, we need much more of that. But I think it's really the separation of us as human nature that is so important to address as well.
So Hassa has given me a great transition to the 2 points that that I would love to make about this one. And the first one goes back to that C.D. Wright quote that I mentioned in my little talk, and I'll repeat it. It is a function of poetry to locate those zones inside us that would be free and declare them so. And for me, the hope that rises perpetually in me, and the hope, I can't write without hope. I write out of hope and into hope. I'm not a writer of despair. The thing that gives me hope, or that drives my hope, is that I actually really believe that we all have in us these zones that want to be free. And I think of those zones as being encased in habit. And we all default to habit because it's so easy to do that. It's much easier to follow a habit than to break a habit and do something else. But the fact that we all carry within us the desire to do something else is the thing that gives me hope. Is if we can help people make contact with those hopeful places, then that will provide a kind of catalyst. And then the other thing that I would say is, and I don't think this is going to sound hopeful to a lot of the people who are listening, but we are part of nature. Back to what Hasse was saying, whether we know it or not, we are part of nature and natural creatures. And the thing that gives me hope on my most despairing days is my apprehension of geologic time and my absolute confidence that no matter what catastrophe our human fecklessness brings upon the earth, in fact, the earth will survive and nature will survive. The creatures that we have co-evolved with and that we love so much because it's in our genes to love them, the whales and the rhinoceros and all of those creatures that we have driven to the edge of extinction, if they go and if the bees go, we will also go. And over the next 7 billion years before the earth is swallowed up by the sun, the earth will recover and remake itself and create a whole nother set of creatures that will co-evolve together and love each other as fondly as we now believe that we love the ones that we are vanishing from the earth. So that's both despair and hopefulness at the same time. I don't harbor the illusion that the earth needs me. I need the earth, but it doesn't go the other way around. The earth will be okay.
Thank you. I'm really intrigued by this kind of tension I see. I think it's a productive tension in the project where I hear from Hasse this sense of calling people to a personal responsibility. And then also from you, Catherine, about a sense of humility and releasing responsibility and trusting geologic time too. And I'm really intrigued by that. And I think that's really beautiful. I also want to, and Hasse, you unmuted. Did you want to say something else?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So I'm struck by, as a dancer, that's my medium, is the body. And so I'm struck by a lot of these amazing metaphors that have come up, like this idea of moving within ourselves and then moving out together, digesting and processing the grief and loss that we're feeling and the challenges we're facing. And I'm also thinking about how do we make that movement from the personal to the communal in a way where we're not becoming saviors and we're acknowledging the right for communities to speak for themselves. So how, as you all talk about and think about in this project, this idea of protecting communities that are disadvantaged and most at risk, how are you doing that in your work? How are you acknowledging your own privilege and positionality, while also acknowledging that different communities are impacted by climate differently?
Well, if I could jump in here, because one project that's not, we have so many sub-projects as part of this that hopefully people will see when everything gets broadcast on Earth Day. But one thing that's been really important to us is to include, especially Indigenous people. And it's not been easy to be honest, but what we, but a collaboration that I've been extremely excited about, and you saw a little bit of it in the trailer, where you saw Caden do a hoop dance response to Pam Ustyuk's phenomenal poetry about the Southwest loss of birds. So we spent quite a bit of time getting various Native American groups involved. As I said, Pam Ustyuk, poetry, Southwest-based poet, wrote some fantastic poetry on this, and we had the Ute elder Larry Sespooch, who's a Ute spiritual leader, read this poetry, and then we had this young Navajo woman, Caden Denny, create a dance response to this. So this is part of the segment of the program that we call From Loss, which really deals with the loss of especially these groups of people. And that part was extremely humbling to me to deal with, because I am not at all, as a person, part of that community whatsoever. I'm fascinated by it, but I have no connection of understanding. So really, we had an amazing recording session at the Native Gallery at the Natural History Museum. And I felt like we were just sort of standing back and participating in a very passive way of what both Larry and Caden wanted to express, and Pam as well. And it was probably one of the most touching parts of our production was Larry making a Ute, in Ute language, a blessing for the whole project. We do have it recorded, but we are not sharing it. It's a very sort of personal, it was a very personal moment for him, but it was extremely important for him to bless what we are doing from that angle. And I was extremely honored by that. So I would say we've really gone out of our way to try to really incorporate this. And at the same time, I have learned so much about that aspect of it that has really humbled me, because this is a daily sort of immediate, direct existence with the consequences of what we're doing to this earth that Indigenous people are feeling.
John, you unmuted.
So one way we're trying to tackle that question about the impact on perhaps less represented community is to go back to what I said earlier, which is to make the pollution in those communities more visible. So I'll just mention two projects I'm involved in. One is the measurements of pollution on the TRAX trains. And the TRAX trains go through different parts of the valley, mapping out the pollution in the city. Another project which is ramping up this year, that's led by Daniel Mendoza, but I'm also involved, which is to make use of electric buses. So the buses can be sent to different parts of the valley and really go into neighborhoods, and we put sensors on them. So I think that's just one step. And I'll go back to the earlier theme of connecting to other forms of expression. So the science and getting the data is just one thing. That data can be made available to those communities, and they can do whatever they want with it. They can be made into art and sort of appeal to so many levels of human experience and other aspects as well. So that's sort of two little things I've been doing.
Speaking of Daniel Mendoza, I was involved in the committee at the university that got the Dark Skies Studies program with the journal, et cetera, up and running. And Daniel's been incredibly instrumental in that. And one of the things that has happened with that project, which is also really interdisciplinary and engages the arts, et cetera, is that they've been mapping light pollution and where it occurs and how it affects different communities, and how, in fact, the ways in which we very brightly light and often even harshly light disadvantaged communities actually leads to less safe rather than more safe environments. So the kinds of misconceptions that we have around that specific kind of pollution. And then quickly about the project, because I want to make sure to mention Javier's decision to set the poem that he chose for a child singer. So I think that the most disadvantaged community that we have is the next generation all over the world. And it seems to me that Javier's choice to do that actually really expands for me the emotional potentiality of that poem. And I was really grateful that was the choice he made.
And I think what I can add is, I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to listen. I'm actively participating in whether it's committees, whether it's local groups. I'm also have attended the Nature of Cities Festival 2 years now, once fortunately in Paris and more recently on Zoom with the pandemic. But it's people from all over the world and all different kind of communities to understand how these perceptions might be very different from the one that I grew up in or the one that I live in. And I think through that, it's been eye-opening, and there have been things that I never had considered. So I really believe how we start to talk about social justice and equity is to listen and to learn. And we have to take active participation, and interdisciplinary collaboration, again, is going to go a long way to helping us understand different perspectives, learn new vocabulary to be able to do that. I think that that's going to prove to be key.
Asa.
Yeah, and I think it is time to fully unlock the potential of the arts. I think if you look back through history, and again to kind of go back to what I started by saying, you see many occurrences where art played a very pivotal role in suicide, like this change in society. Now is what we're doing, is that going to make people go out and buy solar panels and stop driving? Or no, probably not. It's not the point. The point is, that would be an ad, right? That would be, but if you look even just in the 20th century, it's, many totalitarian regimes from the Nazis to Stalin, Russia or Soviet Republic, they understood that the arts had, it's interesting to look at when the Nazis came to power. One of the first decrees that was made was to control the art, right? It's not a coincidence. There was an understanding that this is an extremely powerful thing to control, and for whatever reason, especially with something like climate change, it has just become this matter of belief. Whether you believe in the science or not, to me, that's absolutely crazy. Science is science, but that's how it's ended up. So the arts is really, in some ways, our most promising avenue to bridge that gap and actually move forward from this, what I would consider almost a deadlock, right, between those in society who say, oh, this is not a problem, and those who say, well, we will not be on this planet much longer if we don't take action. So this is our best opportunity to break that stalemate, I would say, in current society.
I love that. Art is a way to move forward. And on that note, as we're wrapping up our hour together, I have 50 more questions I'd love to ask you all another time. Hassa, what's next for the project? What's coming up in terms of events?
A lot. So let me just share some things from our website, and maybe first with our Earth Day program, so everybody knows what's going on April 22nd. And I'll just briefly describe each project. So the video mosaic is is a call that we have sort of spread around the world for submissions from anybody about their expressions of climate change. We've gotten some amazing contributions, and that will be made live at 12 o'clock on April 22nd. Then we have Hour of Decision, a cycle of 4 elements, which is a group of students doing an amazing project looking at the 4 elements in the world and the impact of climate change on that. So this is all run by students, all done by them. Crossroads Project is an incredible project coming from Utah State University and the Fry Street Quartet, who has for many years been exploring what we are exploring with this project, and we're so excited to have them participate in our events. And then we'll have a wonderful panel discussion moderated by Doug Fabricio with a different group of collaborators than the one you're seeing today. And then finally, at 7 p.m., we'll release the full production of the expressions of loss and hope that we just primarily been talking about today, the various collaborations that we have commissioned. So I encourage people to go to our website and explore all of this. There's a lot of information up there, and there'll be more and more information as we get closer. And there's a little countdown timer here, so we all can get super stressed out, those of us who have to complete stuff for this.
And will the content be kept going after Earth Day?
Yeah, so everything that we have produced, and there's a number of things that we will have to have a timeline on, like the Crossroads project. We have an agreement with the length that it'll stay up, but pretty much everything else will stay up indefinitely, and we are looking for ways to expand the project after this day as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to each of you, and I'd like to turn it over to Anne to close us.
Perfect. Thank you, Liz. And thank you to our panelists for your contribution to this forum. We are so grateful. The arts and the environment is such a great way to engage students in Earth Week and to teach us how we can change our actions. So thank you for all of the work that you're doing and for sharing it with us. And then I'd just like to share, we have a couple of events from the Sustainability Office that are going to be happening before that Earth Day. If you go to sustainability.utah.edu, you can find more of these events. But just like a light introduction to some of them, later today at 4 p.m., we have a GSCS seminar with Liliana Common, Native Environmental Science faculty from Northwest Indian College. And then tomorrow, you can join in with the Marriott Library, ASU Sustainability Board, and Sustainability Office for a classified book discussion. On Thursday, we have another keynote address about healing and feeling resilience in an age of climate chaos. And then on Friday, April 16th, you can take a self-guided tree tour. And then, of course, like Hassa mentioned, Earth Day events on Thursday, April 22nd. So go and check those out as well. Thanks to our audience for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next forum.